welcome to the January episode of Fintech Firebrand. I'm Virginie O'Shea, founder of Firebrand Research, and I'm here to chat to you about this month's FinReg and Fintech news. Now, I'd be remiss not to start by talking about the World Economic Forum this month. It's probably one of the biggest events globally that's happening in January and in Davos in Switzerland. And a lot of discussions, as every year, around technology, the future of financial markets. I think in previous years, we've had a lot of buzz around the topic of blockchain, for example. This year, it seemed to be unsurprisingly overtaken by the topic of artificial intelligence, or AI. So certainly there's been a lot of discussion. We've had a lot of the leaders of various AI firms talking to banks, talking to world leaders about how AI could shape the future of work. Some very interesting statistics about the idea of 60% of the workforce being replaced by AI in the future, potentially, maybe 30% in the near future. Certainly very ambitious targets there with regards to the future of work. But on the less sort of buzzy topics, there was certainly much made of the incoming regime in Europe, the Digital Operational Resilience Act. There's been a lot of discussion about that in the industry overall, but cybersecurity was certainly front and center at WEF this year as well. Davos attendees, panelists, had a lot to say about the rising threat of cybercrime. There was an interesting discussion one of the days where an executive that heads up the asset and wealth management of JP Morgan was discussing how they've seen an increase in attacks over the last year. There was a doubling of attacks from the previous year. So they noted that the bank faces around about 45 billion attacks on a daily basis with regards to AI, which is extremely significant when you think about how many different attack vectors that may be. The bank has been focusing a lot of the efforts of its technologist team to try and combat that threat. They noted, the speaker in Davos noted that 62,000 technologists internally are focused on combating these threats, and they're also spending about $15 billion per year on cybersecurity, which is a significant outlay. Now, obviously, this year is the preparatory year for DORA to go into force. We're going to see it come into force potentially in January 2025. I say potentially because there has been a huge amount of pushback from the industry over recent weeks. AFME in Europe has fed back to the powers that be at the EU level, the Commission and ESMA, that the deadlines are relatively aggressive, especially given the amount of market structure change that's going on around the world. Need I say T+1 is obviously coming into force in the North American markets in May this year. So that's going to be a very large project for a lot of financial institutions. We've also got a lot of discussion about T+1 in Europe too. But in the meantime, we've got more than enough to wait to change with regards to DORA. We've just seen the publication this month also of some of the final technical standards, which is basically the guide or the manual to how to implement DORA within each individual financial institution. We have not had all of these published yet. Some are still out for consultation because the second batch of those ITSs and RTSs came out in December. So we still have a consultation period going on the proposals at the moment. So there's a lot of moving parts with regards to DORA, and certainly the industry feedback that January is an unrealistic deadline could be fairly vital discussion point this year. So certainly a lot of activity, a lot of spending going on, and DORA will add to that with regards to reporting requirements. So a big fintech outlay and a big area of spending for financial institutions across the sectors. Now, it just doesn't target banks, it also targets every financial institution, so asset managers included. There's been a lot of discussion, as I previously mentioned, about outsourcing arrangements and some of the pressures firms are facing about reviewing those outsourcing arrangements and dependencies, particularly with regards to mission critical functions. So I expect this to be a topic that's going to be discussed much of the time this year. So certainly keep a watch on that space. Now, another big FinReg item from the EU level this month has also been the European Parliament approval of the revisions to the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive and the regulatory aspect of that, MiFIR, MiFID II and MiFIR. So certainly every 3 years we have a cycle where massive directives and regulations get reviewed at the EU level, and this is part of that. So the approval means that some of the proposed changes that were tabled by ESMA and the European Commission have now been approved. They will be going into force. And one of the big items there with regards to fintech vendors, data vendors out there, is the call for consolidated tape providers at the EU level. So there's a proposal that these vendors should be pitching to the European Commission over the next few months. They will be in February, they will be having an open day almost to discuss some of the requirements and some of the key tenets that these providers need to bear in mind with regards to providing consolidated tapes. So certainly that's another big area for discussion going forward. The plan is to have 3 consolidated tapes by mid-2026. So again, very aggressive on the time frame for that. And there's obviously many aspects to MiFID II and MiFIR under review that should also be good talking points throughout the rest of this year as well. Another interesting development within the UK, obviously last year we had the entry into force of the consumer duty regime in August, and that's focused on protecting consumers in the UK. We have many tenets to that as well. An interesting development this month is that the FCA is now has now set up an industry group to discuss how it's a working group to discuss how the financial advice sector is advising consumers on the topic of sustainability. Obviously, again, the FCA has recently in December put out guidance of its own sustainability requirements for the market-wide, similar to what's going on with SFDR at the EU level, but at the UK level. So big regulatory changes around that. This industry group should be helpful, sort of focused on protecting consumers, similar to what's going on under consumer duty, but with a particular focus on sustainability. So again, some relatively important discussions will happen within that industry group, no doubt, for the financial advisors out there within the country. On the FinReg front in the US, a couple of interesting enforcement actions taken by the SEC to kick off the year. A very large fine directed at JP Morgan this month with regards to some of the areas around whistleblowing. There was some action taken by the regulator to address some of the policies that were set within one of JP Morgan's divisions that it felt would prevent whistleblowers from coming forward to speak to the SEC with regards to client contracts. So certainly that's something to keep in mind going forward. There's certainly a big focus at the SEC and the CFTC on protecting whistleblowers, encouraging more whistleblowing activity. So certainly it's a very sensitive area for the regulator, as it is sort of a bedrock to their enforcement activities. So certainly you can understand why they want to be protective of it. Another interesting development as well, another fine was meted out for Morgan Stanley, which was 249 million related to fraud in block trading as well. So certainly some big actions to kick off the year. I know that the SEC has long been talking about its role as a primary enforcer in the US market. So, and there's a lot of points to prove with regards to that. So certainly expect to see much more activity this year, given though that we'll see elections in the US towards the end of the year. That might impact some of these activities. They'll certainly impact rulemaking, implementation activity, but it'll be interesting to see whether it impacts enforcement activities also. Don't forget, we've also got a lot of different elections across the EU. We've got EU level elections, we've got the UK potential elections, and many more across the globe. So certainly they will interfere with FinReg activity later in the year, but certainly interesting to see some heavy fines coming out the gates with regards to January. Another big, I guess, activity this month, big discussion point, was the approval by the SEC finally of the Bitcoin ETF proposals. 11 out of the applications got approved by the SEC mid-month. oh, actually, it's the start of the month, in fact, and certainly a lot of discussion, a lot of activity about who is winning the race in the initial week of Bitcoin ETF trading. It has seemingly BlackRock and Fidelity seemingly have cornered the market almost with regards to ETF activity, but whether these ETFs continue to bring in as much flow as has happened in the initial week is yet to be seen. It'll also be interesting to see by the end of the year what the AUM is, because that's obviously how we judge the success of an ETF. So certainly something long awaited by the market. I think we've been, the applications have been in there for several years. There's been a lot of discussion about it, particularly on the FinReg podcast that I do with global custodians. So certainly there's a lot of interest in seeing the longevity of this particular trend, and likewise with regards to what happens in the crypto universe or the landscape as a result of it. Now, I mentioned it earlier, but certainly one of the biggest things to watch, and this is my final thoughts for the month, is the preparation for T+1. We've got, far less than 100 days, 100 working days now till the implementation in May. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of concern about the short time frame in which we have to introduce changes. There's been a lot of focus, I think, on the confirmation affirmation space, maybe not as much focus on some of the other additional areas that need work, particularly asset servicing, corporate actions, that kind of thing. So it seems we may have something of a late stage panic when it comes to the implementation deadline. We may see some panic buying. Certainly, there's been a lot of work in the North American markets, but the international community maybe isn't quite as prepared as some of their counterparts in North America. But far be it for me to say that everybody in North America is prepared at this point in time. I think there's a lot of testing activity still to come. I know that DTCC has been leading that, and certainly there's a lot of focus on that work. But I expect to see many more discussions this year. I think we had many last year about some of the biggest concerns, and many that have been raised to us related to FX, related to liquidity, related to securities lending, for example. There's a lot of concerns about these things. Certainly, it'll be interesting to see on the FX side what happens with CLS and that settlement system there that needs to also be tweaked to take into account the changing time frame. So a lot of things to begin the year to watch for, and certainly many more things will probably crop up in the next 11 months.